Hello, everyone, and welcome to Police Off the Cuff Real Crime Stories. We have some unbelievable breaking news. It's a shock to me. I think it's going to be a shock to everyone else. But apparently, Bryan Kohberger, whose trial was supposed to start on August 18th, they're in the process of all kinds of hearings. Apparently, according to News Nation, he is taking a plea deal. And he is going to plead guilty to the murders of Zana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogen, and Kaylee Gonzalez in exchange for a life without parole, take the death penalty off the table. Shocking to us, but let me play so you know that I'm not making this up. This was just 10 minutes ago from News Nation.
Breaking news coming in from the state of Idaho once again, but on a different story, as News Nation has just learned that the accused killer, Bryan Kohberger, accepted a plea deal. Yeah, a plea deal was offered. He has accepted the deal. Sources are confirming that prosecutors proposed dropping the death penalty. That was the deal in exchange for Kohberger pleading guilty to committing 4 murders and pleading guilty to burglary as well. So guilty plea in exchange for no death penalty. Now, the background on this story, you'll remember he's accused of killing those 4 University of Idaho students at their home. It was back in November of 2022. Sources say Kohberger must also agree to spend the rest of his life in prison without any possibility of parole. So jail for life, no parole. But again, no death penalty. Must waive his right to appeal as part of this as well. Plea deal has been accepted. A court hearing for a change of plea will take place on Wednesday, so in 2 days. So this is just breaking. They'll be covering it in more detail tonight on Elizabeth Vargas Reports and also on Banfield. One of many big stories we're covering. Now,
thank you for watching. Subscribe below and down.
That is a huge breaking story. I believe that News Nation is the only station so far that has jumped out on this story and is reporting it. Now, we know that this case goes back to November 13th, 2022. It's a case that has been published, has been followed all over the world. There has been at least 2 books written on this case, one by Howard Bloom, one that has yet to come out by James Patterson. A Dateline NBC documentary came out on this case, and these are the 4 victims in this case: Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Now, I can't even imagine how their parents feel about this, that there is finally going to be an end to this. This is 2.5 years this has been going on. As we know, the Ann Taylor was trying to do everything within her power, raising another defense, an alternate suspect, asking for a continuance, alibi of that Bryan Kohberger likes to drive around in the middle of the night. But let's face this, folks, and there's a lot of bullshit artists on YouTube that have made up all kinds of crap during this case. And I can say it now because I, Professor Mike Geary, Phil Grimaldi, and everyone that's appeared on our show has said over and over that Bryan Kohberger is guilty as hell. And we said that there were tractor trailers full of evidence against Bryan Kohberger. And we were criticized as that, oh, those old cops don't know what they're talking about. Guess what? We do know what the hell we're talking about. And I'm not really, and I told you so, guy, but I was annoyed by a lot of people that covered this case. There's a lot, as I said, to put it frankly, there's a lot of bullshit artists on YouTube, content creators that just make things up, that have no credentials whatsoever. When we look at some of these past thumbnails, Kohberger's defense requests a trial delay. And to the credit of this judge, of Judge Hippler, he deserves credit for this because he was a by-the-book, by case law, and he refused to give a continuance to Ann Taylor. This case could have dragged on for years. But guess what? We know now Yes, you see it on the screen. Kohberger requests a trial delay. The judge said, no, it's been 2.5 years. Witnesses being inconvenienced, witnesses being called forward. And even though, and this was one of my recent thumbnails, a boatload of evidence against Kohberger. And for that thumbnail, I was criticized, roundly criticized. These old cops don't know what they're talking about. So we're just hearing right now that Bryan Kohberger is going to plead guilty. He's going to plead guilty in this case. And the deal is that there is no death penalty. However, there is also life without parole. And he is not shocking witness hearing. We're hearing News Nation is the only one to be reporting this early that about Kohberger pleading guilty. And so it's hot off the presses. It's breaking right now. And, it's coming on some other stations. Let me pull it up. Here we go. This is a local station that Bryan Kohberger is pleading guilty. Let's put this up on the screen. For those of you that don't believe this is actually happening, it is really happening.
News: the Monroe County native accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students has accepted a plea deal. Newswatch 16 Stacey Lang is with us to explain. Stacey, what can you tell us at this hour?
Yeah, Scott, this news breaking just minutes before the beginning of this newscast. So this is the information we have so far. Bryan Kohberger, the Monroe County native, who's accused of stabbing and killing 4 University of Idaho students to death in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho, back in 2022. You probably have heard much about this case so far. We've been talking about it here on Newswatch 16. It has been covered extensively in the national news. Bryan Kohberger has accepted a plea deal. ABC News has confirmed that information through a letter that was sent to the families of all 4 of those victims. That letter says that Bryan Kohberger will plead guilty to all of the charges against him. That includes 4 counts of first-degree murder for which he was facing potentially the death penalty. This guilty plea, he will accept 4 consecutive life sentences. He will agree to serve the rest of his life in prison, taking the death penalty off the table. Now, what we know now is that Kohberger is expected in court in 2 days on July 2nd to go over the terms of this plea deal. We'll learn a lot more then. There was news in this case coming out just today. Our own Emily Kress was in Monroe County Court as 7 different people are being called from Monroe County going to serve or testify rather in this trial in Idaho that was set to begin in about 6 weeks. We were there for those hearings today. This plea deal that we're just learning about now would now make those subpoenas null and void, and also avoids for Kohberger the death penalty. And for those victims' families, the potential of going through a trial that was set to continue through at least November. So we're just learning the details of this plea deal now, Scott. So we'll have much more to talk about tonight on Newswatch 16 and tomorrow as well.
So hot off the presses, you guys heard it right there. Bryan Kohberger, the suspect who's been arrested since June 30th, 2022, is going to plead guilty. And in exchange for that guilty plea, of course, they take the death penalty off the table. So the death penalty off the table, but he will receive life without parole, without the possibility of parole. Just absolutely unbelievable. It's incredible. I mean, one of the things that I'm sort of looking forward to is that we will find out. You don't just get to plead guilty and just say, "Oh yes, I did it. I'm guilty." He has to do something called an allocution. He has to admit to all 4 of these murders. He has to admit to the premeditation, and he basically has to tell the court how he did it and why he did it. And so he can never, ever appeal this case because they're going to They obviously took the death penalty off the table so that Kohberger would plead guilty. And it's I want to play also. I want to play News Nation. That actually they're the ones that broke this case. And from what I understand, they had the information last night. However, it wasn't verified. It wasn't released. But I'm going to play this from News Nation, who about 15 or 20 minutes came out with
breaking news
this.
coming in from the state of Idaho once again, but on a different story, as News Nation has just learned that the accused killer, Bryan Kohberger, accepted a plea deal. Yeah, a plea deal was offered. He has accepted the deal. Sources are confirming that prosecutors proposed dropping the death penalty. That was the deal in exchange for Kohberger pleading guilty to committing 4 murders and pleading guilty to burglary as well. So guilty plea in exchange for no death penalty. Now, the background on this story, you'll remember he's accused of killing those 4 University of Idaho students at their home. It was back in November of 2022. Sources say Kohberger must also agree to spend the rest of his life in prison without any possibility of parole. So jail for life, no parole. But again, no death penalty. Must waive his right to appeal as part of this as well. Plea deal has been accepted. A court hearing for a change of plea will take place on Wednesday, so in 2 days. So this is just breaking. They'll be covering it in more detail tonight on Elizabeth Vargas Reports and also on Banfield. One of many big stories we're covering. Now,
Thank you.
So unbelievable, right? And that was News Nation about 15 or 20 minutes ago. So this is hot off the press. There is so much more that we have to talk about. And this case for me is bittersweet. Bittersweet. Of course, I wish this never happened. Everyone does. But we've covered this case right from the beginning, from November 13th, 2022. And I cannot, as I said earlier, I'm not a I told you so guy. But there were so many arrogant pro-burger people on my channel in the chat that insisted us old-time coppers don't know what we're talking about. But the most important thing is, in a criminal case, is the science of investigation. And the science here, of course, was the DNA on the knife sheath that was left behind next to the body of Madison Mogen, right? So that evidence was just too much to overcome. And we look at all of the strategy, and we talked about circumstantial evidence and how many people also bubbleheads that follow this and don't know what they're talking about, including a lot of YouTube content creators that couldn't find a bad guy in a state prison, but yet they're experts on YouTube. Think of this, right? The circumstantial evidence, which everyone tries to say, oh, it's just circumstantial. Guess what? Circumstantial evidence is pretty damn powerful, right? And right from the beginning, about a week after this occurred, the Idaho police said they were looking for a white Hyundai Elantra. Remember that? Remember that was the thing? And they said initially, it's just a witness. And I knew right away when they said it was a witness, this was the perp's car, And then the University of Washington, one of their security officers, queries all of the students that have cars registered on campus. And lo and behold, he finds a white Hyundai Elantra belonging to Bryan Kohberger, registered to Bryan Kohberger. Now that connected with, as the investigation moves forward, right? As all of the evidence they're putting together in this case, they start connecting it. And I love that word, nexus. They put a nexus between the car and then, of course, the DNA on the knife sheath, which was planted DNA, according to the Kohbergers and a lot of other people that follow true crime. It was planted by the police, And this is so bittersweet. You almost feel, for those that say the death penalty has no function, no reason to be, would Bryan Kohberger have ever pled guilty if there was no death penalty? He was looking at a firing squad, Idaho firing squad. Would he have ever pled guilty if there was no death penalty in the state of Idaho? Would he have ever pled guilty? That's the big question. And the question, or the answer to me, is no, he would not have ever pled guilty if the state of Idaho had no death penalty, right? He would never have pled guilty. So amazing, right? Amazing that I'm just very happy about this. This is from WNEP, another station that came out with this.
The Monroe County native accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students has accepted a plea deal. Newswatch 16 Stacey Lang is with us to explain. Stacey, what can you tell us at this hour?
Yeah, Scott, this news breaking just minutes before the beginning of this newscast. So this is the information we have so far. Bryan Kohberger, the Monroe County native, who's accused of stabbing and killing 4 University of Idaho students to death in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho, back in 2022. You probably have heard much about this case so far. We've been talking about it here on Newswatch 16. It has been covered extensively in the national news. Bryan Kohberger has accepted a plea deal. ABC News has confirmed that information through a letter that was sent to the families of all 4 of those victims. That letter says that Bryan Kohberger will plead guilty to all of the charges against him. That includes 4 counts of first-degree murder for which he was facing potentially the death penalty. This guilty plea, he will accept 4 consecutive life sentences. He will agree to serve the rest of his life in prison, taking the death penalty off the table. Now, what we know now is that Kohberger is expected in court in 2 days on July 2nd to go over the terms of this plea deal. We'll learn a lot more then. There was news in this case coming out just today. Our own Emily Kress was in Monroe County Court as 7 different people are being called from Monroe County to going to serve or testify rather in this trial. Begin in about 6 weeks. We were there for those hearings today. This plea deal that we're just learning about now would now make those subpoenas null and void, and also avoids for Kohberger the death penalty. And for those victims' families, the potential of going through a trial that was set to continue through at least November. So we're just learning the details of this plea deal now, Scott. So we'll have much more to talk about tonight on Newswatch 16.
So a lot of you guys are talking about the fact that he escapes the death penalty. But you know something? A lot of things can, hang on a second. A lot of things can happen when a case is tried in front of a jury. Even when the evidence is overwhelming, as great Orange County, California DA Matt Murphy said over a year ago, he said the evidence against Bryan Kohberger is overwhelming, right? And for that, on my very channel, he was eviscerated by these pro-burgers, these morons, right? And there's lots of them that are content creators on YouTube. All of the people that, you know, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. How about the stories about a drug cartel doing this? How about that? How ridiculous was that, right? So when you follow the evidence and you have half a brain on your shoulders, on your head, you know that the evidence here was unbelievable, And here it is right here. DNA on the knife sheath, DNA on the button of the knife sheath, which of course the others were saying, oh, the FBI screwed that up. They violated the law. They this, they that, right? Just absolutely unbelievable. But we know now, because as I said earlier, guys, is that he not only has to plead guilty to get this deal, he has to do what is called an allocution. An allocution is when the defendant admits to every single thing that he did on this case, all 4 murders, all 4 assault first degrees, possession of a weapon, burglary. And I would hope they get him to give them the knife. the knife that was never recovered. Get the knife. We want that knife. We want that as part of the closure of this case. So all of these things are just unbelievable. And look, for those that say the death penalty is not a deterrent, guess what? The death penalty in this case got this man, Bryan Kohberger, this innocent man that everyone on YouTube was saying the police are corrupt. This guy did it. That guy did it. A drug cartel did it. No, the evidence is what pointed to Bryan Kohberger. The evidence, and an outstanding judge, Judge Stephen Hippler, did his job, refused Ann Taylor's continuance, refused Ann Taylor's. There's another perpetrator, at least 4 perpetrators in this case, would not allow that. All of that good jurisprudence, good decisions by this judge made Ann Taylor go to her client and say, dude, you're cooked. You are going to get convicted and you're going to face the firing squad. That was her job, to advise her client, and she did. And she got her client to plead guilty. Here we are. This is ABC News.
Good afternoon. We have some breaking news here on ABC News Live Reports. I'm Alex Brachet in Washington. Right now, we are following news out of Idaho. Bryan Kohberger, accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students in 2022, has accepted a plea deal. ABC News has confirmed that he has agreed to plead guilty to all counts. ABC News Live anchor Kana Whitworth is on the phone with us. She has been following this case from the beginning. And Kana, what details can you share with us about how this deal came together?
Yeah, Alex, I mean, this is simply a stunning turn of events in a case that has gripped this entire nation. Up until today, we were looking at an August 18th trial date with Bryan Kohberger's life on the line. What we know now from families who received a letter is that Bryan Kohberger has accepted a plea deal. In part of this plea deal, the defendant will plead guilty to all counts listed in the indictment. So that is 4 counts of murder as well as a burglary count as well. He will serve 4 life sentences consecutively with no possibility of parole. And the defendant will waive all rights to appeal this conviction as well. It also sounds like they will be seeking some restitution for families. This is things like money for funeral expenses and, victims' compensation. The next thing that's happening, Alex, is there will be a change of plea hearing, and that is this Wednesday, July 2nd. And so for some, this may be some finality and some closure. For others, you have to imagine, Alex, there are so many unanswered questions in this case, and I'm sure that there's fear that those questions will remain unanswered. But here we are, after more than 2 years, the one and only suspect in the Idaho college murders case, the man who stood accused of murdering Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Ethan Chapin. His name is Bryan Kohberger, and he has accepted a plea deal.
Well, and listen, Kana, of all the trials, it feels like we've been keeping track of over the last several weeks. This was the one that we anticipated was at least going to have some sort of resolution later on in the year at the earliest. But for our viewers that are just kind of catching up, can you walk us through what the past several months have been like with this case?
The past several months with this case, of course, have been Ann Taylor trying to get a delay, a continuance. And what I said earlier on is that we owe a lot to this man, who you will see up on the screen in 1 second. And the man is Judge Stephen Hippler, who's done an outstanding job on this case. Right there he is right there, Judge Stephen Hippler. Enough delay. Let's get this case going to trial. He forced the hand of Ann Taylor, who was doing the old North Carolina 4-corner stall offense. She was stalling. And she knew she wanted more time. What more time for what? So you can just keep stalling and stalling, because she knew her client was guilty. She knew it, right? So let's stall and let's invent 4 alternate perpetrators. And Judge Stephen Hippler saw right through that. Okay, give me evidence of what those 4 alternate suspects, give me evidence of what they did. No, but she was just interested in delay because she had nothing. She had nothing, So the state versus Kohberger. I'm big of reading people's body language, And if you watch this case and you saw Bill Thompson, the Latah County District Attorney, right? His body language as compared to Ann Taylor's body language, you could see that this man, Bill Thompson, William Thompson, the District Attorney of Latah County, was cool as a cucumber, as if he had no worries whatsoever. However, you could see Ann Taylor. She looks a little snide there. She was trying to throw as much garbage at the wall so that she could get this man, this judge, to give her what's called a continuance, to stall. One of the things we would all like to know, because there's been so much conjecture from day one on this case, what was Kohberger's motive? What, in fact, was his motive to kill these 4 beautiful kids, right? Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Zana Knodel, and Ethan Chapin. What was his motive? Did he have any interactions with these kids prior to that fateful morning of November 13th, 2022? Just unbelievable. Claw, I sort of like, as I said, this makes me feel good because I knew that this man was guilty from minute one. And when you hear so many amateurs on YouTube just talking all their bullshit, this feels good. And, is there a little bit of I told you so in it? I think there is. But when you listened to the experts on this case, when you listen to the Matt Murphys, the district attorney of Orange County, California, when you listen to the Bobby Chacones, when you listen to all of the experts talk about the evidence on this case, you just had to shut the buffoons up. And, the pro-burgers, we call them, and I hope I'm not gloating too much, but it just really makes me feel good that, and it also, when we talk about it, folks, in fact, this comes, and believe me, I'm not a big death penalty guy. I feel that the death penalty sort of has, it's sort of obsolete in a way, because there's endless appeals. If Bryan Kohberger had taken this case to trial and gotten convicted and was given the death penalty, it would have taken years, probably 20, 25 years for him to actually receive the death penalty, because there are always endless appeals when the death penalty is on the table. And especially in this case, where Idaho is a firing squad death penalty. Think of all the people that would have been protesting on behalf and say he's an innocent man. He didn't do it, I would have heard a lot of them too. Jolene Foy from the chat. Jolene Foy, 5898. Thank you, Judge Hippler. You know something, Jolene? 100%. This judge was a fantastic judge. He was a tough judge. He knew the law, and he forced the hand of the defense. If the judge was, remember the first judge, Judge John Judge from Latah County? Seemed like a competent man. However, he seemed like an extremely lenient judge who bent over backwards for the defense. And in fact, he was the judge that ruled that they should be granted a change of venue. And thus the case left Moscow, Idaho, and went to Boise, Idaho. And by luck, we from the prosecution got a learned, tough, no-nonsense judge by the name of Stephen Hippler. And Stephen Hippler ruled several rulings that forced the hand of Ann Taylor and the defense team. Aries 323 J3F, she was trying to be part of the new dream team, but it failed. I think she realized when the judge would not grant her a continuance and had ruled against the defense in almost every one of his rulings, and he should have, because the case law was on his side, that Ann Taylor knew she had nowhere to go. She had nowhere to go. She was facing, well, August 4th, she was going to be picking a jury. And she had, however long it took from August 4th on to pick that jury of 12 jurors and 8 alternates. So she knew game was on. This was game time. And the case was going to start on August 18th. So she made a decision. You know something, Bryan, I can't win this case. She went to her client, Bryan Kohberger. I cannot win this case. So this is what I'm advising you to do. I'm advising you at Bev Uranus. Yes, it was, but in the end, I don't think she sucked. I don't think so. I think she had a very, very tough case, Ann Taylor. She's an experienced defense attorney. Unspoken heart stillness. I asked who were his other victims, not his first. Unspoken heart stillness. Let's celebrate this now, and let's not move on to other potential victims. That this will be investigated further once this is Suzanne Seidel. Now, Bill, now you can retire. I will never retire from police off the cuff. This is my life now, now that I've retired from the police department. Joyce Boring, 6507. Yes, he is going to plead guilty to the 4 murders, and he must do what's known as an allocution. You don't just say, yes, I'm guilty. You have to now tell the story of exactly what you did. I hope as part of this story, the prosecution gets him to turn over the knife, so that it just puts a dot on the I. It just puts a cross on the T. And I would like to also know all of the inside information that we were precluded from knowing over the course of 2.5 years. All the inside information that we will now get to know that was being kept secret. Phoenix Effect 157. This is the best for the survivors. I also want to, say more prayers for the families of these kids. And really, I don't know if the family of Ethan Chapin, who's such a great family, they lost a triplet. Ethan Chapin was a triplet, and his other brother and sister went to the University of Idaho. Madison Mogan. Kaylee Gonzalez, whose dad was the face of this investigation for the families for 2.5 years. And here he is with his wife on the screen here. And they were always, Steve Gonsalves was always on TV talking on behalf of these victims and his daughter, Kaylee. And do you think he's taken a big sigh of relief, or do you think he just broke down into tears and let it all hang out, let it all hang out? We will find out. This picture discovered on Bryan Kohberger's cell phone, taken the morning of these murders, with his bushy eyebrows. We're going to find out everything about this case. And all the people that felt that Bryan Kohberger was innocent. He didn't do it. There's no way he did it. He's innocent, And, we talk about this. You see the thumbnail up on the screen. The defense versus the prosecution. Who was better? Who would have won this case? Well, guess what, folks? The prosecution under Bill Thompson here, as I said earlier, he was as cool as a cucumber. He was as cool as a cucumber, and you could tell that he knew something that the defense did not know. He knew he had the evidence to get a conviction. He had the evidence to get a conviction against Bryan Kohberger, and he had all of the evidence. And it's just that in this case, look, when you have that evidence, he scared the defense attorney off. The defense attorney had no shot to beat this case. Let's face it, no shot whatsoever. It's so this case now, and I'm glad that we're all going to find out the truth. We're going to find out what actually happened here. In every step of this investigation, what happened, so important, because we all followed this case, and we religiously followed this case, and us law enforcement professionals called it the way we saw it, and we didn't waver. We didn't waver with all the YouTube nonsense that so many content creators were talking about. This is from NBC News.
And so that's why I think the family is upset about all of this. The defense team, they tried to push this trial to happen later because they were saying they just did not have enough time. They had tried to point the finger at someone else, the judge also saying no to that. So it's been a long road to get to where we are today. Remember, the students were killed in November of 2022, and we were getting close to that trial. We'll see what happens this week, but it appears we won't get there, Hallie.
That's right. Jury selection next month, trial in August. Camila, thanks. I'm going to ask you to stand by, but I want to bring in, Danny, before we get to you on the phone, our NBC News legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, who has been covering this case closely for years now. Laura, thank you for being with us. So we keep saying if this is accepted, that is because a judge would have to sign off on this plea deal, right?
That's right. And so the biggest role that a judge has in a case like this, Hallie, is making sure that a defendant like Bryan Kohberger, especially given the stakes for him, that he's doing this knowing and voluntary, that nobody pressured him into it, that his attorney advised him of all of the risks involved in going to trial, and that he made his own independent assessment, of course, with his attorney's help, but that he made his own decision in this case, and it wasn't coerced. And so the judges typically, in almost every jurisdiction, ask them a series of questions to assess that voluntariness and try to suss out whether or not he really understands what he's doing. Now, given the gravity of what he was facing, the death penalty,
you know something, he understands what he's doing. You know something, I think his attorney, Ann Taylor, made it very clear. The next thing you're going to be looking at is the barrel of a rifle. And because that's what's going to happen, because you're going to get convicted. And if you get convicted, the state is going for the death penalty. Do you want to be killed, or do you want to do life in prison without parole? And the reason I'm happy that this is happening is because, A, it gives a certain amount of closure to the family, although I think many members, many families, and I know the Gonzalez's family, they really wanted Bryan Kohberger to get the death penalty. These two people, these two great people that have been broken by this, losing their daughter in this, these four beautiful kids. Their daughter is the second from, on this thumbnail, the second from the left, Kaylee Gonzalez. So now they don't have to go through a trial. Apparently he's going to plead guilty, all right? So Bryan Kohberger is going to plead guilty. Now, for those that really wanted to see him executed by a firing squad, you don't get that. But what you do get is this person who's going to plead guilty, who murdered 4 beautiful kids in their beds on November 13th, 2022. He gets to go to prison for the rest of his miserable life.
You can understand why he could say, you know what, looking at all the evidence here, looking at the fact that the judge just refused to accept an alternative perpetrator defense, looking at the fact that the judge has basically denied every single one of the sort of meaty motions that he's filed in recent months trying to, bolster his defense. The judge has basically shot them all down. And so if I'm his defense attorney, I'm laying all of that out for him going into this trial. And so you can understand why he may decide, look, I'm not going to risk the death penalty. What's more interesting is why the state did this now. Given we're just a couple weeks out from trial, given that all that the families have been put through. And I think that is the context and background for why you might see the Gonsalves family say this is something that they find abhorrent. Is just given everything they've been put through now to have the state do this, that might be where they're coming from on that. But again, we're going to have to understand the details. We're going to have to understand.
Right. You know, I don't know if the state did this. How do we know that at any other time that perhaps Ann Taylor was presented with this plea deal and she turned it down? So how do we know that the state specifically did this? It's, any prosecutor anywhere in this great nation we live in will tell you that it is always risky, no matter how much evidence you have, to present the case in front of a jury, because you never know what a jury is going to do. You could have boatloads of evidence, or as I said, overwhelming evidence, right? And you never know if a jury is going to have some doubt, and especially in a case where there's a death penalty. Folks, if you're new to this channel, hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, hit the like button, share us with your friends and your family. If you want to join us and contribute to us financially, we have a Patreon with 4 different levels. We also have a YouTube channel membership with 5 different levels. We are police off the cuff, true crime from a police perspective. All of the hosts and co-hosts on this are retired NYPD, and we've worked these cases and we know all about these cases. We're not just keyboard warriors.
And, does this, usually with something like this, he doesn't have a right to an appeal. So once he accepts this, it's over. It's done. He can't, then turn around and change his mind in a couple of weeks. It would be over, and he would lose his right to do anything to contest it, which means he would be behind bars for the rest of his life. He wouldn't have the death penalty, but there would be no avenue for him. There would be no more relief for him. It would be the end of the road.
Laura, you mentioned that statement that was on the Gonsalves family Facebook page here, in which they are, it appears, incredibly upset at the word that this has come in. Beyond furious is the quote here. In a situation like this, Laura, would the judge take into account any victim opposition here? Is that something that comes into play as the judge is making a decision on this, if in fact the state, the prosecutors had said that they would like to move forward?
So I've seen that when it comes to sentencing. I haven't seen that type of thing come in when it comes to the question of whether or not Bryan Kohberger, his decision to accept such an offer is knowing and voluntary, right? It's a kind of a different question.
I see.
And if the question is coming down to like whether or not this is good for Kohberger, right? Because he's the one that the judge is having to try to protect his rights in this instance. And obviously the family has interest, an enormous interest, but the judge is really interested in making sure that he's done what he can to do to protect Kohberger as the accused in this instance. And so I certainly think that the judge, could say, I'm willing to entertain letters from the family about this, but it's just a different inquiry. And so I think it's going to be less in sort of, top of mind for the judge about how the families are looking at it. But I could see them say, look, I'm happy to hear from the families. I'm happy to, receive letters and hear their side of this. But it really is a sort of an offer and acceptance between a prosecutor and the defendant on this, and not as much of the family. What has always been really unusual in this case, Hallie, is how uninvolved the families have been in almost, again, just top to bottom things like whether the house should be destroyed, right? The house where they were killed was torn down and the families were upset about that. There was a lot of other sort of back and forth, whether or not they should be, acquiescing to a change of venue, right? There were all these sort of micro moments along the way in this case where the family felt shut out. And so this is just going to be yet another one.
A huge one. And Laura, before, I know we're going to have to let you go off the phone here, but before we do, I think it's worth reminding folks that this has been among the highest profile cases in the country since, 2022, when these murders happened here. It has captivated the attention of people coast to coast here, given the nature of the crime, given the victims, given the circumstances here, Laura.
Yeah, and part of it is just the facts were so sort of breathtakingly awful from the very beginning. It was every parent's worst nightmare to have their kids sent off to college and something like this. I think there was also just so many questions about what was the motivation. We never got an answer as to what happened. And obviously he has maintained his innocence. He has been.
It's I can understand why the Gonsalves family, Steve Gonsalves, is upset, and his wife is upset. These kids were brutally murdered with a knife. They always say in the homicide investigative world that the most up close and personal way to kill someone is to kill someone with a knife. And usually murder with a knife tells you something about the perpetrator, that there was some personal reason the perpetrator used a weapon like a knife in this case. So these kids, these 4 beautiful kids, were murdered in their beds inside 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, on November 13th, 2022 at 04:15, 04:20 in the morning by a psycho with a knife, A psycho that, do we know why? What was his motive? We still don't know that. What everyone, of course, wants to know, and he had all of the traits of a serial killer. What the hell is this about? This little pose with his left thumb up in the air with his stupid bushy eyebrows on the morning of the murders that was found in his cell phone. What was that all about? Was he trying to be Ted Bundy-esque? Or this picture here, he looks like the Grim Reaper. Is that who he was trying to be? This is not Bryan Kohberger here. This is Bryan Kohberger in this thumbnail in court, in his suit and his tie. This more reflects Bryan Kohberger with his Grim Reaper hood up in the air. Or how about this? The balaclava and all of the evidence that connects him to this crime, right? The balaclava. How about the fact that he ordered a K-bar knife, a knife sheath, and a sharpener from Amazon? That is the nexus between the evidence and the knife sheath. And for some, that wasn't good enough. That doesn't prove anything. The police planted that after all. His family could have ordered that K-bar knife, the knife sheath, and the sharpener from Amazon. It was just that anyone could have ordered it. And the fact that they found that this balaclava here was ordered from Dick's Sporting Goods, the same balaclava he was described as wearing by Dylan Mortensen, who also commented in regards to his bushy eyebrows that we see in this photo. I would think many of the people that were involved in this case that were going to be potential witnesses. In fact, numerous witnesses went to a Pennsylvania court today to answer a subpoena on why they were being called to be witnesses in this trial. And all of them didn't want to be witnesses. They wanted no part of this, that it would adversely affect their life. So there are winners and losers in this case. However, I could understand why the Gonsalves family, Steve there, They know what was done to these victims. They know what was done to their daughter. They know the brutal nature of this crime. And they wanted to see this case go through, go all the way to the end after the trial. And they wanted to see Bryan Kohberger get convicted and receive the death penalty for this case. Apparently, they're not happy about it right now. They're unhappy. But the death penalty in this country as we know it, if Bryan Kohberger after trial would have gotten convicted, it could have taken 10, 15, 20, 25 years for him to receive the death penalty if he ever did. A judge could have commuted it to life without parole. So right now they have this. Apparently, he's going to plead guilty to the 4 murders, the burglary, and all of the charges. And we that have been following this case hopefully will learn when he allocutes. Allocutes is when you admit to every subdivision and every division of this crime. You admit to it that you did it and what your intent was. We talk about mens rea and actus rea. Mens rea is the mental state of mind that makes someone commit a crime. Actus rea is the actual physical act that makes you carry out. He's going to have to admit to both of those things, right? Did he commit this crime with the mens rea of recklessly, intentionally, criminally, negligently, and knowingly? Which one was it? Or was it all of them? So he's going to have to admit to all of that. And we, those that have been following this case, I think we have to be satisfied with this. I think we, as I said, it's always a risk for the state to take a case to trial. And even though they had tons of evidence, as I said, it's always dangerous to take the case to trial. And the state, we don't know exactly, we'll find out exactly who approached who, but the state must have approached Ann Taylor, or Ann Taylor may have approached Bill Thompson and said, we'll take a plea, we'll take a guilty plea, life without parole, if you take the death penalty off the table. That's what happened. We don't know who approached who. We don't know if the state under Bill Thompson approached Ann Taylor or if it was vice versa. What we do know is that there is going to be a guilty plea in this case.
Denied any wrongdoing. He pled not guilty, or I should say he stood silent. He didn't actually ever plead. But the point is we never really got a full answer as to what happened. And I think one of the things the trial was going to, at least I hope, answer, and I think many people were hoping would answer, is what really went on there, and why did he allegedly zero in on them? What was it? What was the motivation there? And I think one of the things I'm sure the family is feeling like is they're not going to get as many answers now without having a full trial to assess all of that.
Laura, would a plea deal shine any light on any of that, any of those questions you just laid out, or could it be as simple as like a sentence or two and that's that?
It depends. I've seen it. I've seen it where, sometimes the defendant, after they sort of get the death penalty thing off the table, which is what he's probably most interested in right now, might actually make a statement. And I've seen people apologize. I've seen people sort of, have a completely different tune than they had going into trial. And I've also seen plenty of really tragic cases where the family has absolutely no idea whatever happened.
Wow. Laura Jarrett, we're glad that you scrambled onto the phone.
So I am. Kay, thank you for a $5 super sticker. So glad that this guy got caught quickly and taken off the streets. Thank you for following this and keeping us notified. I mean, it's a good feeling in many ways that this case now is going to be in the rearview mirror, and I don't know whether the families will be happy about this. Apparently, the Gonsalves family is not very happy about this. In fact, from what we read so far, that they're very unhappy. They wanted to see this case go through the trial, get him convicted, and they wanted to see him get the death penalty. But the reality of the death penalty is that there's endless appeals, endless appeals to the death penalty. So would he have ever gotten the death penalty in our lifetimes? You know, as I said, it could take 10, 15, 25 years for him to get the death penalty once the defense exhausted all their appeals. But it's unending, it seems. So, and what was sort of egregious in this case is that the anti-death penalty crowd, because this was a firing squad, they would find that to be barbaric, and they would even protest this even more. You know, from the chat, Marianne Barline 9486. It is also senseless. For heaven's sake, he could have had a PhD and a life of freedom and solving crimes. You know, it's hard to know, Mariana Barline 9486. It's hard to know what's inside someone's psyche and what motivated them to do such a horrific crime like this. So I understand, but very difficult, you know. Aries from the chat, Aries 323J3F. At least the Gonzalez can rest knowing their daughter's killer will never be among us again in society. Yeah, it seems like the Gonzalez family, though, they wanted Bryan Kohberger to get the death penalty. They wanted this case to go to trial. They wanted to have this case followed through to its very end. But as I said earlier, it's always risky for the state, even when they have tons of evidence, to take a case in front of a jury. You never know what a jury is going to do. So how would we all feel after a trial when we all felt and knew that Bryan Kohberger was guilty? How would we feel if a jury found him innocent? Much different feeling than what we're feeling right now. This was a little bit shocking, I think, but we can all agree that he's going to get what he deserves. Maybe not as bad because he's going to be allowed to live.
For us, given your extensive reporting on this case. Thank you. I know we'll see you later on tonight, tomorrow morning as well. We really appreciate you being with us. Let me go to our NBC News legal analysts now as we're covering these breaking developments. Again, what appears to be a plea deal for the suspect in the University of Idaho murders in 2022. You can see Camila Bernal is with us. We've got Danny Savalos as well. We've got Misty Maris joining us too. Danny, let me go to you here on this because Laura, I think, very cleanly laid out that this is not a done deal yet. And that is important to remind people. It sounds like Wednesday is going to be the day to watch in this case. What could we expect to see go down in court on that day?
Yeah, for criminal defense attorneys, the plea hearing is actually really stressful because you really never know what your client, the defendant, is going to say. And judges vary on the amount of facts they require on the record. We might see a scenario where the judge interrogates Kohberger on what exactly did you do? And you might see Kohberger balk at actually putting those facts on the record. Maybe
Danny, would that be contingent, though? Would he have to answer that question if a judge were to ask on Wednesday? Like, is that something that he would have to answer in order for this process to move forward?
Exactly right. So often what happens if you start interrogating the defendant, that's when they start going off script and maybe trying to massage the facts or give their version. And then the judge says, well, then I can't accept this plea. I don't know that this is going to happen in this case, but it happens all the time. I mean it when I say that plea hearings are actually more stressful for a defense attorney than the actual sentencing hearing, because that's something the lawyers have some control over. But the client, the defendant, can totally blow up the plea hearing if the defendant is unwilling to admit to the specific facts on the record. So I'm very curious to see what this judge will require for a factual basis on the record from the defendant at a plea hearing. And another factor, too, is that the Idaho law and the Idaho Constitution does allow victims, and that includes family members, they have a right to be heard. But that right to be heard cannot trump what the prosecutors ultimately agree to. But they do have a right to be heard. So I'm very curious to see what it is the family is upset about and what degree of communications prosecutors had with the family, because Idaho law and the Idaho Constitution require it.
Danny, stand by for a second. Misty, let me go to you because I know that you have been watching this case closely, and it sounds like, in your view, the defense had basically taken some hits with some of these recent pretrial motions and hearings that we've seen, which may help explain the sort of why now factor. Tell us more about that.
Absolutely. So there were a lot of evidentiary decisions that have been happening leading up to this trial. First, there was a lengthy hearing regarding forensic evidence and what would come in, those DNA matches, the DNA that was found on the knife sheath, and the methodology that was used to connect it to Kohberger. The judge said that's all coming in. They also challenged some videotape where a Hyundai Elantra, white Hyundai Elantra, was seen on CCTV, on camera footage that puts him in the area of that house on the night of the murders. The defense said this is not continuous, it can't come in. The judge said it's coming in. And then lastly, the defense wanted to raise some alternate theories. They wanted to say there was an alternate perpetrator. They identified 4 people, the names are under seal, that they said had motive and opportunity to commit this crime. The judge said not enough evidence. And then the other was an alibi defense. They wanted to say, the defense wanted to say that Kohberger was driving around stargazing on the night of the murders. Now, this was to put him in that, have a reason why he was in that area. The judge said no. So all of those were blows to the defense leading up to the trial.
Danny, one of the things we've also talked about is the way that it seems in these various moments over the course of the last couple of years, and Laura laid this out well, the family had been, in their view, somewhat shut out from some of these key and critical decisions. Is that something, like how much in a typical case are family members of victims?
Folks, to recap, Bryan Kohberger has been offered a plea deal to plead guilty to all 4 murders. In exchange for his plea, he will receive life without the possibility of parole. And the state will take the death penalty off the table. Now, in New York, when someone pleads guilty, especially to a crime like murder, and in this case, 4 murders, they must do something called an allocution. They must admit to every one of the murders and their intent. They must admit to what their intent was. And they must admit to doing it, how they did it. In this case, the judge will be questioning Kohberger. But before it gets to the day of the plea deal in court, the defense should prepare Bryan Kohberger, because as quickly as this plea was put on the table, it can be taken back, and the prosecution and the judge could say, we're going to trial because I'm not satisfied that the defendant understands his responsibility in regards to pleading to this quadruple murder. So it's not over with. However, just the fact that Ann Taylor and the defense has agreed to plead guilty to these 4 murders, to take the death penalty off the table, and to have Bryan Kohberger serve life in prison without the possibility of parole, that tells us a great deal about this case, the evidence against Bryan Kohberger, the evidence that the state had on their side, the power of DNA evidence, the DNA evidence on the button of the knife sheath, the power of circumstantial evidence for all of those people that think they poo-pooed circumstantial evidence. Oh, it's just circumstantial. Let me tell you something. When I see some of the content creators on YouTube, I just shake my head, And some of those same content creators actually had the nerve to come into the chat on my channel and criticize a 27-year NYPD veteran who actually pulled murderers out of their beds at 4 o'clock in the morning. And when I have some content creator from YouTube criticizing me, this is bittersweet to see that all the pro burgers now can go home and eat a cheeseburger, instead of a pro burger, because they were all 100% wrong.
brought into some of the machinations for the prosecution, et cetera, as cases move forward?
This case highlights the fact that victims and their family members are not clients of the prosecutors. They are not even parties to the case. But in the modern era, the trend is to increasingly pass legislation that gives these victims, including their families, and specifically including family members under Idaho law, the right to be heard. But the question becomes, what is the right to be heard? It's not the right to control. Victims and their families have never had the right to control the direction of prosecution. So often these statutes just give these victims and their families the opportunity to voice their opinion. But ultimately, the final decision is always with the prosecutor to enter into plea agreements. And then ultimately the punishment, the sentence, is up to the judge, or in the case of capital punishment, up to the sentencing jury. But although legislation increasingly is giving families of victims more and more rights to be heard, the bottom line is this: they will never be parties. They can never control the direction of the case and the decisions that are made by the state. So when you see that they're angry, it's understandable, because our system has never given them a controlling power in the outcome of a plea deal, a plea offer, or the ultimate sentence.
Let me bring in Dr. Casey Jordan, the forensic psychologist and NBC News contributor, who is joining us now as well. As again, we are in rolling coverage now of these developments coming out of Idaho. News that has stunned apparently family members of the victims based on what we are seeing from some of these public statements, as it appears that the suspect in those murders at the University of Idaho in 2022 has now appeared to accept a plea deal that is in the works now. There is a hearing on Wednesday. It is not a done deal yet, we should note. But Dr. Jordan, let me bring you in here on this, because Idaho, and I want you to talk about the context here, does not have an insanity defense, as it's called, right?
Correct. And it's the only state that has the death penalty but does not have the insanity defense. And from the outset, I was very surprised he wasn't pursuing a plea deal, but clearly he wanted to play the long game and, you know, try for all these alternative theories and see if he could get anywhere. I mean, Idaho is not the state to try that, to be honest. So here we are with him finally, if you will, facing the music. I mean, the jig is up if he goes to trial. And I was looking forward to the trial, of course, but you have an eyewitness, you have unbelievable forensic evidence and digital tracing. I mean, I cannot fathom any way he was going to be found anything other than guilty. Yes. And Idaho is a state that would love to apply the death penalty in a case like this. So I understand why the family feels cheated. His only chance was the insanity defense.
Dr. Jordan, there's also, as we've been talking about, this family statement. And so far, again, this is on the Facebook page of the Gonsalves family, saying that they are essentially beyond furious that the state of Idaho, they believe, has failed them. This is a family, and we've seen this from some of the other victims' families as well, that at various critical moments, Dr. Jordan, throughout this case, as this case has developed, when the 911 calls were released, for example, we have seen them release statements publicly. In other words, they seem to understand that the high level of interest in this, in the circumstances around this case, in the horrific nature of the death of their children here. And this appears to also be part and parcel of that now. They were among the first to come out and say, you know, in that statement, alluding to this plea deal that appears to be on the table here.
I understand their concerns, their emotions, their heartbreak.
You know, just to add, from what I understand, Idaho does not have the insanity plea. So this doctor was talking about the insanity plea. I don't believe Idaho has that, just to correct her.
At not having what they consider to be their day in court. And they are indirect victims of this crime. The fact that he's willing to take a plea deal, it's only a matter of days or weeks before we can call him the murderer instead of the suspect. And I think they really wanted that process. It's very cathartic for them. But you're right, some of these families, not all of them, have been involved in documentaries, in making very public statement, and basically using the media as a tool for getting their emotions out there. And in addition to being a criminologist, I'm also a lawyer, and I understand their concerns. But this is the state of Idaho against Bryan Kohberger versus Bryan Kohberger. Yeah. It's not the families. The state of Idaho has to do what's best for all the people of Idaho. And I believe the plea deal is in the best interest of everyone there. They would have gotten a conviction, but is it really worth dragging it out if he was given the death penalty for years and years and years? It's typically 10 to 20 years before somebody who gets the death penalty is actually executed, if they're ever executed. And that gives them a platform and keeps them in the limelight. So I love the idea that this guy's going to go away with 4 sentences, 4 murder convictions, never see the light of day, can never be paroled. I think limiting the amount of exposure he has in the media is one of the best things we can do for his ego.
I should, Dr. Jordan, thank you.
You know, one of the things someone from the chat just asked, Ponytails 707, why would a judge deny the defense to bring in arguments against the prosecution? That seems biased. Not looking for arguments or criticism, just want straight answers, please. Ponytail 707, I'll be happy to answer that. You cannot allow a defense attorney to invent alternate perpetrators with no evidence. So you come up with 4 names that, incidentally, Ann Taylor got from the tips log that the Idaho police, that the Moscow police got during this investigation. Those 4 names they had investigated and cleared. So Ann Taylor would use those 4 names to create doubt and to say that these are potentially 4 other suspects. But minus any evidence, a judge cannot allow that, because if he allowed that, any defense attorney could just invent other suspects. And that's really what Ann Taylor was doing. She was inventing other suspects with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. As far as other rulings that Judge Hippler made, the continuance, 2.5 years has gone by since these murders. You don't think that's enough time for a defense attorney to prepare for a trial? Yes, it is. He ruled against her on that. He allowed the DNA evidence to come in, even though the defense argued that it violated Bryan Kohberger's civil rights, the fact that they did an investigative genealogical tree, family tree. The judge, using case law, disagreed. And he was right. In all of his rulings, he was correct. So there was no bias. This Judge Hippler is the reason we have this plea today, is because he ruled correctly in every one of his decisions that now resulted in the defense, Ann Taylor, and we don't know whether she approached the prosecution or the prosecution approached the defense and said, look, we'll give you a plea to life without parole, death penalty off the table, no possibility of parole. And many of you are asking, does Bryan Kohberger have to admit to his crimes? Yes, he does, in something called an allocution. He has to admit to every one of these murders and his mental state of mind and the physical action he did to have committed these murders. So hopefully we will all know. And, you can understand the families not being happy with this. I think the Gonsalves family, they wanted the death penalty because of the brutal nature. Steve Gonsalves was on Ashley Banfield the other night, and she asked him a question about the fact that there was evidence that Bryan Kohberger had punched his daughter numerous times in the face before he stabbed her to death. How painful must that have been for Steve Gonsalves to recount that and to tell that? So this is a father who lost his beautiful 20 or 21-year-old daughter. I forgot how old Kaylee Gonsalves was at the time. But you can understand that he wanted the death penalty in this case. And I think anyone out there that has children and has been following this case, they can understand why.
you. That's important context here. I should note that we still don't know a lot of the details of what this plea deal would or would not entail. We expect to find those out in the hours to come. But Danny, as somebody who is in your other job, your day job, a criminal defense attorney, can you help us understand what the conversations may have looked like between the defense team and between Bryan Kohberger here about the possibility of a plea deal being on the table? Is that something that comes up early on in the process, early on as the case has been taken up? Does that only come up once there have been some setbacks for the defense? How does that typically unfold?
I am so fascinated by this issue because it's something, you're absolutely right. It's something that defense attorneys have to deal with throughout a long pretrial process early on. You must communicate to the client the opportunity to take a plea and to consider pleading guilty. And oftentimes at the beginning, the client wants nothing to do with a plea. Now, what's very interesting here is that Kohberger, in the case of public defenders or court-appointed attorneys, the client or the defendant is not losing their own money. So they have maybe an increased incentive to go to trial. You often see in cases where private counsel's being paid, clients and defendants, they run out of money and it makes them rethink a plea. Now, of course, they can only plead guilty if they are in fact guilty, but that finances are often a consideration. That was not a consideration in this case. So maybe someday we'll find out what the tipping point was for Bryan Kohberger. It might have been the loss of the opportunity to delay the trial. It might have been the loss of some of these motions. And I just have to say as an aside, never have I seen defense attorneys fight so valiantly. They must have filed hundreds of motions. They filed every motion I've ever imagined, and then some I've never even heard of. They fought valiantly, and so I wonder at what point Bryan Kohberger decided, I have changed my mind, I'm going to take a plea. Because his attorneys publicly, they didn't just say he's not guilty, we're going to defend him. They didn't give those pat answers. They affirmatively said things like, we believe he is innocent. I'm paraphrasing, yeah, but these defense attorneys fought the good fight. It'll be very interesting if we ever find out why Kohberger changed his mind and when.
From the chat, Amy K, 9431, police off the cuff, just asking because I don't know about a plea. There wouldn't be any reason to plea if he were truly innocent, correct, Bill? Thank you so much. No one would plea if they were innocent. You know, if you were truly innocent, he wasn't going to plea. I mean, you can make an argument, he was facing the death penalty and he was afraid. Believe me, if you're innocent, you're not going to plead guilty to 4 murders. There's no way on this earth you would do that. Now, when we recap this case, and I'm sure this is going to be over-reviewed by all the talking heads on every single channel, they're going to come out of the woodwork, all the talking heads that have been on during the life of this case. What was the strongest reason and what was the strongest evidence that this case had that resulted in Bryan Kohberger apparently going to take a guilty plea? Well, I think that's obvious, and we called it numerous times, and other professionals in the criminal justice field. I don't count the Kohbergers as some of these morons that just have a keyboard in front of them and all of a sudden anoint themselves as an expert and start to create doubt for the trial. The strongest evidence, obviously, was the DNA on the button of the knife sheath, which some of the content creators tried to convince us was planted by the police. You know, when I hear that kind of nonsense, it really drives me crazy. But so the evidence in this case, and I keep going back to Orange County, California prosecutor Matt Murphy. The evidence in this case was overwhelming. And that's what would make Bryan Kohberger plead guilty, that the evidence was overwhelming. Not that he felt some need to plead guilty. Not that his defense attorney was inadequate and the prosecution had a stronger case. But what the prosecution did have on their side was evidence. And again, the strongest evidence was the single source DNA on the knife sheath. That was the strongest evidence. So when everyone looks back at this case, that's not one piece of evidence, but that is the strongest piece of evidence, the DNA on the knife sheath. And that, I think, is what made the defense consider a plea to guilty and take life without parole. Because Ann Taylor, as you see on the screen right now, she was looking for a continuance. This Judge Stephen Hippler, was having none of it, was not going to allow a continuance. He was not going to allow some of the motions that Ann Taylor put forth to stand, because the evidence was there, New witnesses, of course, even as in the last few weeks, the DoorDash driver that, according to her, could identify Bryan Kohberger as being on the scene of 1122 King Road prior to the murder. There's the picture of the DoorDash driver. So all of this evidence, all of this circumstantial evidence piled up. And that was one of my thumbnails on one of my shows. There was boatloads of evidence against Kohberger. And that happens to be true. Even though, again, I took a lot of criticism over that thumbnail. Boatloads of evidence? What are you, crazy? Oh my God, I'm used to taking criticism. I was NYPD for 27 years, and they always told us from day one at the academy, you're the police. You have to have thicker skin than the average human being. And I accept that. I have thicker skin. So you want to call me names, go ahead, But I knew I was right, I knew I was right, and I knew that a lot of people that were covering this case were clueless, absolutely clueless, And Lore 7, no, the families do not have to give their approval for a plea. That is between the prosecution and, of course, the defense and the judge. The families are told about it. They're not consulted. They're not asked, are you okay with this? GM9805 from the chat, from what I've seen, the families are not happy about this. I think they should have consulted with the parents before, just my opinion. Well, I'm sure they told them about it, and the families are not happy about it, but they certainly don't have to get permission from the parents. Thomas Dabrowski, 5996. Can the families make the prosecutor change their mind, or is this a done deal outside of what the judge may do? Can the families persuade the judge to say no, not accepting it, trial? No, they cannot. They cannot. This is between the prosecution, the defense, and the judge. And as I said earlier, most prosecutors know that even with the strongest case on earth, you never know what a jury is going to do. So what's the old expression? One in hand is worth two in the bush. Hate to use that stupid expression, but it's true. So a conviction is hand in hand is worth a conviction after trial, which you may or may not get. So there's going to be many people analyzing this case, and I'm sure they're all over the channels right now. Let's go back to NBC News and hear a little more from them.
I just want to also say, too, and Misty, let me bring you in on this. There is a chance, right? We are providing information here, 6:53 p.m. Eastern, about what we know to be true based on our reporting as we are sourcing it to you from, again, the attorney for one of the family members here, that there appears to be this plea deal. It is potentially possible that this blows up on Wednesday, right?
Absolutely. That plea hearing, as Danny says, he's absolutely right. That is a stressful day. The judge could ask questions. There's a record that's created. Also, the Kohberger will need to say that he is knowingly and voluntarily entering into this plea deal, that he understands what this means as far as his rights as a defendant, that there's no appellate process. If he does this, he can't appeal the plea or the sentence. So all of that is going to play out on Wednesday, and we may learn more at that hearing, but until it's done, it is not done. So we're just seeing the reporting. This could certainly fall apart in the coming days, or we could get more insight on Wednesday as to what we're really going to hear on the record.
Camila, let me go to you because you reported from Idaho in the days after this happened. You were, I know, launched up there. You were one of the teams in place, and you talked to a lot of people in and around the community. The intense focus on what had happened, this just shocking set of circumstances, is part of the reason why the defense team wanted a change of venue for this case, right?
It absolutely is. And back in November of 2022, everyone was terrified. It took some time for authorities to hone in on Bryan Kohberger. And when you were in Moscow, Idaho, everybody would be looking at each other to see who would have done this. Everybody was scared of someone they didn't know in town. This is obviously a small college town, and everyone was scared, not just in Moscow, but around the nation as people learned about this nightmare. Of course, the families have gone through so much. We've gone through a roller coaster. You know, a lot of times we forget that first day when we first reported on all of this, authorities there said there was no foul play. And then the next day or a few days later is when they said, actually, yes, it appears that these students were targeted. So it's been a roller coaster of emotions for so many people as they've watched all of this unfold. And of course, when we found out about Bryan Kohberger, everybody sort of breathed a little bit easier because they knew that there was at least a suspect in this case. The families, we've been talking a lot about the families, and they have gone through so much. You know, I spoke to Steve Gonsalves a few months ago, and he had told me how difficult it was to start getting some of this information. As we learned more, as we reported more, he would say, you know, this is like drowning and then coming up for air and then getting pushed back down again. Those were the kinds of things that Steve and the whole family had been talking about. And they really wanted to see this trial because they wanted to know what happened in this case. And if it doesn't happen, there's of course going to be still a lot of questions for people who are in Moscow, for people all over the country who wanted to know how this all happened. We've seen small details in terms of the Amazon purchases, in terms of the surveillance video, but there are still so many more questions that a lot of people were hoping to get the answers to during this trial. We'll see what we get. You know, we talked about also Bryan Kohberger not even saying anything during his plea. So it will be interesting to see if he says anything on Wednesday, and we expect him to, likely, but he didn't even want to speak during his plea. It was the judge who entered a not guilty plea on his behalf. Right. Of course, he was a student in all of this. He knew what he was doing in a sense. And so it'll be interesting to see how he handles this one.
There has also been, as we talk about the intense level of interest here, and Danny, I'll go to you on this, when you talk about what happens in the courtroom, what happens in the court of public opinion as well. We've followed a number of the developments, including the judge allowing a roommate to testify. This is the only known eyewitness of the whatever happened that night.
Well, you know, that's actually not true. I believe she's talking about Dylan Mortensen, who saw a man, and she described the balaclava, and she described the bushy eyebrows. But she cannot say, as far as we know, that that person was or is Bryan Kohberger. But she described the bushy eyebrows, and there it is, a picture from the morning of November 13th. Mr. Bushy Eyebrows giving a thumbs up. Is that like a trophy photograph, him celebrating the murder of 4 young people? That's what we're asking. But we know, and then he became even more sinister with his Grim Reaper look, you know. And this was the balaclava that apparently he was wearing, and that he purchased at Dick's Sporting Goods. So many things. So I believe there is so much evidence that that the prosecution has that has never been turned over, that we don't know about. Because, again, the gag order held a lot of us back from knowing all of the evidence that the prosecution had. And so we didn't find out a lot of things. And everyone assumed that if it wasn't in the paperwork from court, or if it wasn't in the arrest affidavit, if it wasn't in the motion, then it didn't exist. And that's simply not true. So I expected there to be a lot more evidence. I mean, I would like to know, and hopefully when he allocutes, when he admits to his crimes on Wednesday, I would like to know how he accomplished what he accomplished and had thwarted a lot of the evidence getting inside his car, evidence perhaps getting inside his house, how he murdered 4 people with a knife and didn't cut himself and didn't leave his own blood behind in the crime scene. So all of those things are questions that I have. You know, folks, this is Police Off the Cuff Real Crime Stories. If you like real crime, true crime from a police perspective, you're in the right place. And if you're not subscribed, hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, hit that like button. And if you want to contribute to us financially, we have a Patreon with 4 different levels. And we also have a YouTube channel membership with 5 different levels. And you could join the Police Off the Cuff family, friends, and subscribers by promoting us on our YouTube or our Patreon. Go back to NBC.
Of the murders that night, who repeatedly mentioned seeing, and I'm quoting here, bushy eyebrows. This became a real point of contention. I think people will remember at one of these hearings back in the spring, but the judge called that testimony highly relevant because of the fact that this roommate was really the only survivor, the only known person who saw what went down.
The only reason this became an issue, and you're looking at the picture of the alleged bushy eyebrows now, the only reason this became an issue is because Kohberger's defense team fought on every single issue, and they challenged the witness. I've done this before, where you have a witness you don't like, and you think, well, how can I challenge not what they say, but their ability to have seen what they say they've said? So, for example, you show that maybe their vision was blocked, or in this case, that she was clouded, this witness, by her intoxication or the fact that she was tired. And so instead, early on, sometimes you challenge whether the witness really even saw what they said they saw. And that's the only reason we get this sort of debate about bushy eyebrows. And really what the defense was arguing was such an uphill battle. They were saying that, look, this isn't exactly an eyewitness identifying Kohberger. The only thing the witness is saying is that she saw bushy eyebrows. And that's not enough for an identification. She was too tired. She was too intoxicated. She shouldn't even, we're challenging her ability to have even seen this. What an uphill battle. What a long shot motion. And that's the only reason this came out into the ether for us to look at. The reality was the judge made the right call. Something like this is an issue of credibility. The defense is free to cross-examine the witness. Oh, did you see anything in addition to bushy eyebrows? Where were you standing? How much did you have to drink? But that's a trial issue. That's not something that gets knocked out pre-trial. And that's how because of that fight, the defense attorneys fought. That's why the bushy eyebrows even came out as early as they did, instead of as they normally would have at trial through cross-examination.
And just quickly, Danny, given that jury selection was supposed to start in almost literally, I think, a month from today, I want to say July 30th, how far along would the prosecution have been in building this case and preparing for trial to begin in August?
I would assume they were mostly ready by now. Keep in mind, as much as there were filings on this case, both sides filed so many motions. I've never seen so many. There were also so many that were what's called ex parte. They were hidden. They were sealed. We didn't even see most of the motions. Presumably, they'll be unsealed at some point in the future. And we may have a wealth of knowledge about this case that we never imagined. And I expect that to be true. And in fact, one of the judges even remarked that, hey, we're doing too much of this ex parte, sealed, not on the record. And once the case is over, presumably those things will be unsealed and we'll learn a lot more about what the prosecution had. But when you consider that even what was publicly known was so damning, I can't imagine how much more they had. The prosecution was ready to go.
I've said that I give this attorney an applause. I've said that the entire length of this case. I think the prosecution has tons more evidence than they have revealed. And all the pro-burgers were like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You're an old sergeant, And, I don't know. I just can't help but feel the I told you so factor, and, Doug Gross, S4R, new member. Welcome to the Police Off the Cuff family. Thank you so much for joining our channel. Very much appreciated. And folks, the rest of you guys that are brand new here, hit the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, hit the like button, share us with your friends and your family. You can join us on Patreon or our YouTube channel membership. So we're going to learn so much more about this case. I really do believe we're going to learn so much more in the next couple of days, because so much more is going to come out.
I want to thank all of you, Danny, Misty, Camila, Casey. I'd like you to stand by, though, for just a minute, because we are now ticking across to 7 o'clock Eastern time, 4 p.m. out west, where we have major breaking news. What can only be described as a bombshell apparent plea deal out of Idaho, where the man accused of brutally killing 4 University of Idaho students in 2022 has apparently been offered and has accepted a plea deal, according to an attorney for one of the victims' families. We're talking here about Bryan Kohberger. His trial was highly anticipated, set to begin just about a month from now, in a case that shook the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, shook the country, really, with that trial just weeks away. Kohberger is accused of stabbing and killing Zana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Ethan Chapin. He'd been facing the death penalty. Now, the family of Kaylee Gonsalves on a Facebook family page posting online just as this story was developing this, saying, "It's true. We are beyond furious at the state of Idaho. They have failed us," the statement says. They go on to say, "Please give us some time. This was very unexpected. We appreciate all your love and support."
So, I think you can totally understand the Gonsalves family feeling that way. But as I explained earlier, any prosecutor will tell you there is danger in taking a case to trial. And the danger is that you never know what a jury is going to do. A jury can have all the evidence, and someone can raise doubt, and you can get one juror to buy into it, and you can lose the case or get a hung jury. So when you get a sure conviction, and even though there's so much emotion to this, because it was a death penalty case. This was from ABC News for those that are just joining us.
On ABC News Live Reports, I'm Alex Brachet in Washington. Right now, we are following news out of Idaho. Bryan Kohberger, accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students in 2022, has accepted a plea deal. ABC News has confirmed that he has agreed to plead guilty to all counts. ABC News Live anchor Kana Whitworth is on the phone with us. She has been following this case from the beginning. And Kana, what details can you share with us about how this deal came together?
Yeah, Alex, this is simply a stunning turn of events in a case that has gripped this entire nation. Up until today, we were looking at an August 18th trial date with Bryan Kohberger's life on the line. What we know now from families who received a letter is that Bryan Kohberger has accepted a plea deal. In part of this plea deal, the defendant will plead guilty to all counts listed in the indictment. So that is 4 counts of murder as well as a burglary count as well. He will serve 4 life sentences consecutively with no possibility of parole. And the defendant will waive all rights to appeal this conviction as well. It also sounds like they will be seeking some restitution for families. This is things like money for funeral expenses and victims' compensation. The next thing that's happening, Alex, is there will be a change of plea hearing, and that is this Wednesday, July 2nd. And so for some, this may be some finality and some closure. For others, you have to imagine, Alex, there are so many unanswered questions in this case, and I'm sure that there's fear that those questions will remain unanswered. But here we are after more than 2 years. The one and only suspect in the Idaho college murders case, the man who stood accused of murdering Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Ethan Chapin. His name is Bryan Kohberger, and he has accepted a plea deal.
Well, and listen, Kana, of all the trials, it feels like we've been keeping track of over the last several weeks. This was the one that we anticipated was at least going to have some sort of resolution later on in the year at the earliest. But for our viewers that are just kind of catching up, can you walk us through what the past several months have been like with this case?
It's been tumultuous. There has been filing after filing and pushback from the defense, initially trying to delay the trial. They have maintained their client's innocence this entire time. They wanted to have the death penalty taken off the table. They tried many times unsuccessfully for that to happen. In the meantime, this has been under a gag order. So people involved in this case have not been able to speak out about it, which is why so much of this case has been shrouded in secrecy. We thought that it was going to go to trial in Moscow, and then it got moved down to Boise, and then it got pushed back yet again. And so here we are now, about a month before this trial was supposed to start, and we have learned that instead of a trial, there will be a plea deal.
And Kenna, do we know that in this plea deal, was there anything that was taken off the table? Was the death penalty taken off the table?
The death penalty is taken off the table. So exactly, in exchange for pleading guilty, the death penalty will be taken off the table. It's a pretty standard cut and dry plea deal. There weren't very many concessions, which you have to imagine there may have been families out there that wanted concessions like that.
Well, and the other thing is, because we just saw your interview earlier today with the friends of some of these victims. I don't know if you've had a chance to speak with them since this news, but for our viewers, how are they hoping to remember their best friends?
It's so important, after speaking with Emily Allant and Hunter Johnson, the two that were the first to arrive at that King Road home, that the world remember their friends for how they lived their lives and not for their last day, not for how they died. I had a chance to speak with Ethan Chapin's entire family as well, and their family motto is to live like Ethan. He was a beaming, bright ray of sunshine. All of these kids were really described in that manner, and that's what's the most important here, is that we remember these kids, we remember how they lived, and we don't lose sight of the families here. Maybe there's finality here, but they never get to wake up with their kids ever, ever again.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. I remember in that interview hearing one of the friends talking about how they really kind of rejected this label of the Idaho 4, because you had four individuals who had different personalities and very much their own identities here, and that's something that we certainly don't want to lose.
So just unbelievable. When this, I actually first heard this was going to happen before it was reported by the news, and when people in this biz, Bobby Chacon, retired FBI agent who's been on my show numerous times, he told me that this was about to happen before it officially happened. And at first I was like, whoa, who's going to confirm it? Who's going to put it out there first? And News Nation actually reported on this first, that about the plea deal that's going to go down on Wednesday. I don't really see anything going wrong relative to this plea deal. I don't see that the judge is going to question Bryan Kohberger and he's going to get cold feet. I believe that this is absolutely going to happen. And hopefully we will learn much more about the case, things about the evidence, things about what occurred than we know right now.
News: the Monroe County native accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students has accepted a plea deal. Newswatch 16 Stacey Lang is with us to explain. Stacey, what can you tell us at this hour?
Yeah, Scott, this news breaking just minutes before the beginning of this newscast. So this is the information we have so far. Bryan Kohberger, the Monroe County native, who's accused of stabbing and killing 4 University of Idaho students to death in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho, back in 2022. You probably have heard much about this case so far. We've been talking about it here on Newswatch 16. It has been covered extensively in the national news. Bryan Kohberger has accepted a plea deal. ABC News has confirmed that information through a letter that was sent to the families of all 4 of those victims. That letter says that Bryan Kohberger will plead guilty to all of the charges against him. That includes 4 counts of first-degree murder for which he was facing potentially the death penalty.
So, folks, I don't know what your feelings are about this. Myself knowing about criminal justice, knowing about prosecutors taking cases to trial, I think this is a pretty good outcome. And I think that perhaps the families of the victims are upset right now, but Bryan Kohberger will never walk on the face of this earth again. And this little demon you see on the screen will be sitting in a jail cell for the rest of his life. And I don't know if that really helps the families, gives them that overused word closure. I don't know if you can ever have closure when you lose 4 beautiful people like this. Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Xana Knodel, and Ethan Chapin. That's what this case is all about. But I think it's good for us all to know that for us that have been following this case, who have been working this case, that Bryan Kohberger is going to take a plea on Wednesday. And we'll be watching, we'll be listening, and we'll be reporting on this case. And I want to thank everyone that just tuned in. I just went live unexpectedly because I had heard about this. All you new folks that joined me tonight, and again, I implore you to hit the subscribe button, join the Police Off the Cuff family here. This is a great channel. We have great insight. We got great experience. And all we need is you. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your night, and God bless.
One episode just ain't enough.